Good morning. As Libby said, my name is Thomas Hawkins. I'm an adjunct faculty member at Levin College of Law and occasionally do research projects in the conservation clinic there. I'm going to talk about a report that we published with the Department of Economic Opportunity about a year ago now, I believe. By way of starting, how many folks in the room are certified floodplain managers or have a lot of experience with CRS? All right, that's about half the room. That's pretty good. I am not a certified floodplain manager and most of my interaction with CRS is through this research. So I would love any thoughts or feedbacks that y'all have with your sort of greater experience in applying CRS in a real world scenario. All right. This slide presents some of the folks that were involved in funding and putting together this research. We began with a project that was funded by the Department of Economic Opportunity. The state was looking to, I really do two things. One is give new reasons for folks to look at the CRS and apply CRS in their communities to get the flood rate reductions. It's been a prerogative of the Department of Economic Opportunities in recent years. And then also the second one is take advantage of grant funding opportunities from the federal level, including NOAA, to improve our awareness of and responses to sea level rise. I've also got National Park Service logo up here. In the last year, we've been doing a little bit different research looking at sea level rise and cultural resources. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to tie the two together a little bit and point out some ways in which the CRS Manual can also address reducing hazards and threats to cultural resources due to climate change. Libby gave a good introduction to CRS, so I'm going to be brief here, but might go into a little bit more detail than she did. CRS really has three goals. Reduce damage to insurable property is one that Libby definitely focused on. There's two others that I don't think we focus on quite as much. And the second is to get better actuarial data to make the insurance program more sound. So we're not just interested in reducing risk of flood loss, we're interested in making the system work better economically so that the program is run with greater economic soundness. And some of the things that get after that actuarial soundness are generating better data, better floodplain maps, which are creditable activities. And then finally, there's quite a bit in the CRS program that credits improving floodplain management generally, which I think is just general good public policy. And of course, the benefit to local communities is when they enter in this program, ratepayers that live in those communities pay lower premiums. Here's some terminology that's commonly used in the Coordinator's Manual that folks might not be familiar with. It's organized into activities, and there's three series of activities, the 300 series, the 400 series, and the 500 series. And so each series is made up of several activities, and then each activity is made up of several elements. The 300 series is generally things related to public information. The 400 series is generally related to two things: one, local government regulations, and two, mapping, generating that better data to make the system more actuarially sound. And then the 500 series relates specifically to things like physical changes to properties or to landscapes that reduce risk of flood damage. And then here's the big takeaway if you're in local government or if you're a ratepayer in insurance. You accumulate credits, your CRS class goes down, you start at 10, go down towards 1, and you get a real rate reduction on your flood insurance premium. This slide might be a little bit dated. This is as of the Coordinator's Manual that's dated 2013, had some changes that specifically related to sea level rise, including credit for mapping areas, future flooding due to sea level rise, credit for notifying property owners in the 300 series of sea level rise, and some requirements for getting very high class ratings for addressing risks of future flooding. So now into this publication. With that background, This is the document that we published in conjunction with the Department of Economic Opportunity. It's titled Crediting Adaptation Strategies Through the National Flood Insurance Program's CRS Coordinator's Manual. And of course, those adaptation strategies are adapting to sea level rise. One problem, here's actually, before I get there, a little background on obviously why sea level rise matters in Florida. This is, should be old hat for most of y'all. Our coastal counties contribute tremendously to our gross regional product, and as of the most recent census, more than 3/4 of our population lived in our coastal counties. And we're seeing investments in infrastructure that we make today will still have a useful life well into when we're seeing actual changes on the ground from sea level rise, to the extent that we're not already. I pulled this graphic because it obviously relates to us locally being here in Tampa Bay today. This was produced by the Geoplan Center at the University of Florida, but the median projection for 2080 sea level rise is 4 feet, and there's a projected sea level that you can see depicted red in here having significant impacts in the area of the Port of Tampa Bay. So this is the first conceptual problem that we ran into in trying to create a guide that both addressed sea level rise and the CRS manual. Typically in Florida, in our planning materials, when we talk about addressing sea level rise risk, we talk about 3 strategies: retreat, accommodation, and protection. So these are common in the literature, and they're common in the framework from a growth management perspective. This is very typical of the language that's in a local government's comprehensive plan, et cetera. But those 3 strategies, retreat, accommodation, and protection, don't fit well with how the coordinator's manual is structured. As I mentioned earlier, it organizes its strategies into public information, into regulations, and also generating data that address risk. And then finally, in these physical activities under the 500 series, really the retreat, accommodation, and protection might all fit under the 500 series. And there's no conception in the retreat, accommodation, protection framework to think about things like campaigns for public information. So we knew right away that trying to create a single guide that addressed both of these ideas needed a different framework for thinking about sea level rise adaptation strategies than the one we typically see in planning literature, particularly local government planning literature in Florida. And so we pulled this framework. This diagram is adapted from a publication by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that organizes climate change strategies a little bit differently. So the 3 categories here, if you can't see, on the left in blue are structural physical, with subcategories in the engineered built environment, technological, ecosystem-based like green infrastructure or environmental restoration, and then finally services. So a structural and physical service might be how local government manages sanitation. In the center column, what's in yellow, are social strategies like education, like informational strategies, ways to influence public behavior. Those kind of fit under the 300 series category. And then finally, institutional includes things like economic incentives, laws and regulations, and government policies and programs like grant programs. So those fit more in the 400 series, where we're talking about things like local government regulations and incentives for mapping, et cetera. So a little bit broader perspective here in the IPCC than what we see in some of the planning literature in Florida. So I know you guys can't see this chart. If you get a copy of our publication, and it's available on the website, Libby was forward-thinking enough to have put it, the full URL for that in the agenda. So if you have a digital copy of the agenda, you can just click on that. If you've got a hard copy of the agenda, make a note. If you just Google UF Conservation Clinic and come to our homepage, there's a link to this document on the right-hand side of the homepage. And this is the centerfold. So when you open out that document, this is our beautiful centerfold image. And so what it is it's those categories that I just talked about from the IPCC on the left with the same color coding, blue for structural, physical, yellow for social, and green for institutional. And then across the top, what's in this fine print are specific activities or elements from the coordinator's manual, starting first in the 300 series, second the 400 series, and then last the 500 series. These last two columns here are some creditable activities that don't come from the coordinator's manual itself, but come from the coastal erosion manual, which is a supplement that also lists creditable activities or ways to augment credits you might earn under other categories. And then the check marks represent points of intersection. You can see a little bit of clustering, whereas the structural physical category is focused in the 500 series. The social category focuses more on the 300 series, and that has to do with kind of those points of intersection that I described when we were going through that flow chart in the previous slide. So the majority of the rest of the presentation are sort of tear sheets like this. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, depending on how much time we have. How are we in time? We're doing pretty good. That address specific adaptation strategies at the top. Now that's the big headline. And then the bullet points underneath talk about how that action is creditable under the CRS. So the first one is an adaptation action area. How many folks are familiar with adaptation action areas? There's an optional comprehensive plan component for local governments that are required to do a coastal conservation element under the Growth Management Act, can do adaptation action areas where they create specific areas of concern in their comprehensive plan where they want to focus on sea level rise adaptation. And programs like this are creditable under the 500 series for being proactive planning for floodplain management. Beach nourishment, which is something we do very, very commonly in Florida, literally renourishing our beaches, very often paid for or performed through the Army Corps of Engineers, is creditable as a 500 series activity under element 542F. Land acquisition. One of our focus communities that we looked at in doing some of our background research and seeing how communities on the ground dealt with this was the city of Yankeetown, just north of Crystal River. And Yankeetown has a relatively high or low, good CRS rating, in part because they have a very large amount of land in permanent conservation that's floodplain that's adjacent to their city. It was a large undeveloped piece of property. A conservation easement was acquired by a land trust. The city has a community center on it, and the city annexed it. And in getting credit under a 400 series activity, you can earn credit for having a large protected from development pieces of property in your floodplain. Now, of course, land acquisition is also a great way to very really address threats to sea level rise, particularly if it's land that might be subject to development but is at threat for flooding where it developed. Oyster reef restoration is another creative activity for reducing storm threat, et cetera, and is creditable under the CRS manual. You both get credits under the coastal erosion manual that I mentioned earlier and under 300 series activity for doing mapping for areas that should be protected for things like oyster reef restoration or nourishing other marine ecosystems. Living shorelines similarly is creditable both under those two sections that I mentioned previously, but also directly under Activity 422, which credits natural shoreline protection. Interesting to note there is, in contrast to living shorelines, building seawalls and other bulwarks is not creditable under the CRS manual. So that's a sort of forward-thinking policy perspective of the manual, is you do not get credits for constructing seawalls. Programs for public information. If you communicate the threat of sea level rise to folks who live in your community, that's a creditable activity under the 300 series. Voluntary rolling easements are a relatively new concept of a kind of conservation easement that defines an area to be conserved or to not have a hardened structure based on proximity to mean high tide. And it's called a rolling easement because as the mean high tide line changes and rises as a result of sea level rise, the area protected by the easement moves inland. And so you might literally, in a situation where you have a voluntary rolling easement, a property owner who sells an easement to a conservation trust that he or she knows will one day encroach on development on the property. It's sort of a pre-acceptance of the necessity that in some cases we will need to retreat from sea level rise. Riparian littoral buffers, amending a local government zoning code or comprehensive plan to add new or to increase buffers from riparian areas is creditable under the 400 series, which, as we mentioned earlier, credits local government regulations that protect from sea level rise risk. Likewise, freeboard, increasing the height of structures through regulations, is both a sea level rise adaptation strategy and a credible activity. Increased stormwater storage, local government regulations that require more stormwater storage for development on property is creditable activity. Extending planning horizon. If you work from a normal 10-year comprehensive, the 10 years that's standard for comp planning in Florida, you might not anticipate impacts of sea level rise in that timeline. However, if you increase your planning horizon to 30 or 50 years, you have a whole lot more uncertainty, and you would rationally look to accept a whole lot more, identify a whole lot more risk from sea level rise. Likewise, extending that planning horizon can earn you credits in the CRS program. And then finally, just because something is not mentioned in the manual doesn't mean it's not creditable. Unlisted activities can earn credit if you do something that's rationally related to the idea of protecting from risk of flood, increasing the actuarial soundness of the program, or improving your floodplain management. That activity might earn credit even if it's not identified in the manual, and you need to work with your certified floodplain manager to determine that. So just the last 3 slides, I'm going to focus on this cultural resources idea. I love this picture. This is the mouth of the Miami River. Has anybody ever taken a boat tour of Biscayne Bay right up close to Miami? I mean, it will impress upon you like nothing else how the city sits on just a razor-thin piece of land above the water. And I think this picture shows that very well. This park that you can see, a little bit dark picture, I think I need to increase the contrast there. But this park is the Miami Circle. Is anybody familiar with Miami Circle? Can you tell us what it is?
I've been there before.
It looks just like a neat urban green space, but it's an archaeological site that was developed in 500 to 900 AD. And there's artifacts there from all over the Americas. This was an important trading route, apparently. And the site is there, and it's been preserved. There's no development on top of it. It's a public park. But this is an example of a cultural resource that's at risk of inundation from sea level rise. It literally sits very, very close to the water. And it's not just sites like this. It's historic districts in our coastal communities, from Fernandina Beach to Cedar Key to all over our coastal communities in the state of Florida. We've got historic districts, historic homes, historic resources that are at risk because of sea level rise. And so there's quite a few things in the CRS manual that are creditable activities, but that we can use as tools also to protect our cultural resources from risk of sea level rise. So one is acquiring cultural resources, which, just as acquiring land can be a creditable activity and can protect those resources. So if you acquire cultural resources that come with real estate in the floodplain, that can be a creditable activity. Sharing information about flood risks to cultural resources. Better mapping of cultural resources. A lot of local governments do not periodically update their records on the historic resources or the cultural resources in their historic districts. Doing so is a good idea for knowing and developing strategies for protecting those resources, it's also a good idea because it can get you credit in the CRS Manual for identifying where vulnerable structures are and for doing some work to quantify their vulnerability. Historic building inventory for the same reasons. Financing adaptation of historic buildings, developing programs to adapt historic buildings to the risk of sea level rise, extending the planning horizon as we've already discussed, and creating an adaptation action area as we've already discussed. So hopefully that was a helpful presentation and overview, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, particularly from, yes, is it Maya?
Can you comment on the concept of rolling easements and, given the private property rights in the state of Florida, how likely you think they are to hold up? Unless, if they're perfectly voluntary, fine, but beyond that, I'm just kind of how feasible they really
I would emphasize the word voluntary in the name. I think that if you had a regulatory approach that imposed a rolling easement, you would run into takings concerns, even if it's literally the sea that's causing the property line to move. However, if it's set up similar to a conservation easement where there's tax or other financial incentives for private property owners to subject themselves to this kind of easement, I don't see any legal risks. Any other questions? And I apologize that I won't be around for the panel, so if you have any, please ask them now. Great.
One question.
Oh, yes, ma'am. From League of Women Voters. I love the League of Women Voters.
We have a lot of plans in the works right now for certain developments and bridges and transportation infrastructure. They've been in the works for a long time. Most of them do not take into consideration sea level rise. What opportunities or legal strategies might be available to encourage that some changes be made now before these things be built out in the way that they are?
That's an excellent question, and I'll give a couple of answers to it, and probably none of them are very complete. So one is by example, the U.S. military has been very proactive in looking at this, and in Norfolk, Virginia is actually requiring that bridges be built at new higher heights, anticipating a higher mean sea level rise for ship clearance. So it's a very real practical concern. In terms of enforcement, I don't know of legal strategies or liability strategies that would get different behavior from state agencies. The FDOT has actually been relatively progressive in trying to identify threats to its facilities from sea level rise. There's a tool, and I think actually the diagram that I showed of Tampa Bay comes from this tool that was produced by Geoplan at the University of Florida, funded by FDOT, that allows you to look at areas in the state, pick a sea level rise risk, pick a year in the future, and see what anticipated inundation might be. And FDOT paid for the production of this to be able to look at where threats to its facilities were. But it's got much broader applicability than that. And then the third answer I'll give is there has been a lot of research done on local government liability for not planning for sea level rise, and I'll give two specific examples. One is the Growth Management Act currently requires local governments to base their comprehensive plans on good available data and analysis, and the data and analysis is pretty clear that we are facing risks of sea level rise. This is a real and legitimate concern. And so one could argue that if a local government, and I don't know if anyone has outside of scholarship, but if a local government is not doing that, it's not in compliance with the Growth Management Act. So that's one. And then the second kind of area of liability for local governments is there's a case out of St. Johns County where the county, I think, was failing to maintain old A1A because literally the sand underneath the road had eroded. And as a result, several private properties did not have a right-of-way by which they could access their properties. Properties became inaccessible because there's no longer a improved right-of-way. And property owners sued the county successfully for its failure to maintain that infrastructure, which is this, if you're involved in local government and you're making infrastructure investment decisions, should be a cautionary tale. Once you build it, you have an obligation to maintain it at some level. And not exactly sure where that minimum level is, but local governments should be hesitant to build things that are at risk to sea level rise because they may be required to continue to provide that infrastructure going forward in the future. So that's a bunch of answers. I don't know if they really got at the core of what you're asking.
So let me ask you a follow-up to that, because you work with, what's his name? He moved down to Miami. He does the legal side with Coastal.
Yeah, and Thomas Rupert is the lead researcher on the ideas that I just described.
So right now we have a scientific paper out via this committee, and we know that certain elevations or freeboards by that paper is required. However, many of us do not have that freeboard built into our regulations yet. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, because as what you just said about the comprehensive plan, we could be held in non-compliance, but there could be even more situations coming along if one of our local governments understand that you're allowing someone to build below the base flood elevation, which is going to be maybe 10 or 15 years in the future, or even 20, that could put us into some legal situations as well. So it'd be interesting to hear your comments on that.
Well, so Rupert's argument, as I understand it, and it's been some time since I've read his argument on the subject, but my recollection of it is he's essentially saying that the Growth Management Act today requires local governments to look forward into the future, kind of as you're describing, not just looking at what base flood elevation is today, but what it's likely to be in 15, 20, 30 years. And assuming he's correct, I still don't know how that's enforced. We don't have a lot of aggressive review of local comp plan amendments by DEO.
In your construction code, you're not looking at proposed conditions, you're looking at existing conditions, which is fine. That's legal as of today. It's just as you just mentioned, though, now we know by a sanctioned group that the elevations are going up, and you're permitting structures and facilities that are going to have a known life expectancy of 50 years plus.
If your question is whether a local government would have liability for approving something that's consistent with its comprehensive plan, but the comprehensive plan might not have been adopted with best data and analysis, I don't know. I would think possibly not. Once the comp plan's in place and no one's challenged it, I don't know how liability would attach. But it's an interesting question. It's actually a great question. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you.